Okay, what is a wash? Well, a wash is a thin fluid layer of ink or paint. Usually that's done over a broad area, but it can be over any area at all. Small areas are also. Now I use the term wash and it's equivalent to laying in for me. Meaning I'll lay down a color and then I'll paint over it. And sometimes they call that underpainting also. But before we get to the actual demonstration, we need to talk about some of the tools. You can lay in a wash with brushes, of course, and I'm going to show you the various ones here. Usually they're flat brushes. I use a small one for small paintings, medium, and this one's nice and thick. This is a 1.5 inch brush, and it is made specifically for washes. This one is 2. This is another size of wash brush, and this one here, this I don't like very much, but if I'm going to cover a large area, I'll use this thing here too. Now what's important about your brush? You have to use a brush that's going to hold enough paint for you to make at least one stroke across the entire surface of your paper. If you run out of paint halfway through your stroke, you're not going to get a good wash, and it's not going to work well. So you get one that's thick enough, and it requires practice, and fill it up with your paint. And if it goes more than one stroke, that's great, because you're going to dip it back in there again. Now, if I'm doing a very large painting, it's hard to find a brush that'll hold enough paint to go across 30 inches or more of watercolor paper. In that case, I resort to an airbrush. This is a very inexpensive one. It has a very large jar on it. I could probably never use all the watercolor there. Here's a smaller one. And the way this works, this particular model of this, is you get a can of compressed air, you screw this down on it, and then you start spraying. You put your paint in here, right here, or right here, and then you start spraying your background. And then the bad thing about this, it throws out a lot of water, penetrates your paper, and if you don't have your paper stretched or tied down, it's going to start buckling. This is the most inexpensive way to do it. If you really want to get high class, you got to get yourself a compressor, which is expensive, and a beautiful airbrush like this. Dual action. Those are single action airbrushes. This one you can press down, and then you pull back for the amount of paint that you want to use. Very nice. You can also use sponges. There's also a technique out there, a beautiful technique, and they do a really beautiful job of laying down paint with these little gadgets, little squirt bottles. And the person that does this, the artist that does this, you have to see some of her work. It is really, really amazing. But you can practice with these. It requires a lot of practice. Most washes do. And you can get really good at making some beautiful effects. Some people, and I think there's books out there also about just pouring your paint on your paper, and that's fine. That's just another way of getting paint out there real quick. There's some other things you'll need. Tape. Do not use masking tape on your paper. All right, this particular tape here is regular painter's tape. You can buy it at any hardware store. It's sticky on this side, and it's not sticky on this side. And it comes in different colors. I prefer the brown. There's a blue one out there. And what this does is when you're laying in your wash and you're using this tape, you use it to mark off areas that you don't want that paint to go into. Now, a word about tape. If you're using rough paper, the paint's going to creep underneath this tape. I don't think there's anywhere around it. Cold press, which is not as textured, you have to burnish it down, and even then you might get a little paint creeping up underneath there. You have to use a thin paper like this. You know, I've even heard people using the tape for packaging, the clear tape for putting on packages. To me, that's a little too adhesive, and it pulls up on your paper when you try to take it off. This is a low tack. It's a nice paper to use generally all around. Another thing, you're not going to do just straight lines. You might want to try Frisket. Now this comes out of the airbrush people's world, and what you do with this is you lay it down, you draw your curve on it, or your shape that you want on it, and then you cut it out and you put it back over that shape, and then when you put your paint or your airbrush over it, it leaves that, and it saves the whites also. Now, another variation on that is what we call liquid Frisket, masking fluid. There's various types. This particular one is white, and I apply it with what they call an incredible nib. This is for small areas and areas, again, once you put it on there, you can leave it for a little while, and it's pretty good. Do not use an air dryer when you're using Frisket to dry your paint. It will mess it up. Once you get it on there, as soon as your painting dries, get it off there. There's no reason to leave it on there. The longer you leave it on there, the harder it is to dry. You can use a brush, but if you use a brush to put this on with, you may as well kiss that brush goodbye for anything else. One other thing. Paint, some of the paints have this ingredient in it. It's called Oxgall. What this does, it makes your paint flow very freely. It reduces the tension, the surface tension of the water and the paint on your paper. So I use a little bit of this every time to help my paint flow a little better. It's part of watercolor paint. Watercolor paint really is just gum arabic, honey or glycerin, and a little bit of this, and sometimes they throw in a little something else to make it work. Okay, the paints I'm going to use tonight, and we'll discuss paints later. I'm going to use blues, primarily because that's when people put in washes, big washes in the background. It's going to be sky, it's going to be water, all right? And I'm not going to get into real deep about these paints right now because that's a separate presentation. But I'll tell you, I'm going to use Peacock Blue for one of the demonstrations. This is a transparent blue, and it's staining. I try to use staining colors when I'm doing an underpainting or when I'm laying it in, because what happens is it doesn't lift out. Once you put this on, it's going to stay. You can forget about trying to lift it or move it around. It's not going to go anywhere. Right? And the next one I'm going to use is Ultramarine Light. And it's an easy lift, meaning I can put it on there and I can lift out the colors after it's dried, and it doesn't stain. So with that, I'll talk about the two types of washes or underlays, underpaintings that we do. We do them on wet paper and we do them on dry paper. Now you're going to hear the term wet and wet. I don't subscribe to that. It's okay to say that, but it's not okay to think that. Really what you're thinking is wet into damp. Your brush always has to be wetter than your paper. If it's not, it's going to pick the paint off the paper. All right? Now, of course, that doesn't apply with dry paper. So what we actually do is, relatively speaking, when we put down a wash on wet paper, we better have more water in our brush than it's on the paper. And I'll show that to you here when we start. Okay?